I remember a couple of years ago, there was some young Mennonite guys who described how they rode their bicycles all the way from Pennsylvania down to Paraguay for Mennonite World Conference 2009. And I heard them give this description. And these guys, it's a long way to go, and so they had to depend at many points along the way on other people. And they talked about how as they were riding through Mexico, they'd get to these little villages along the road, and they'd stop there and get some water and whatever, and people would say, our village, we're really friendly, welcoming people, but we just want you to know, be careful, because down the road, that next village, not so much. You're going to want to be careful. And they'd get to the next village, and they'd have some water, and they'd feed them. But we're really friendly and welcoming here, but we just want you to know, down to the next village, not so much. You're going to want to be careful. Well, after several times of this, right, they started to kind of take it lightly, and they were pedaling along a road in Mexico. These two young Mennonite guys from Pennsylvania, and this van pulls up along the road behind them and kind of tails them real slow. And at that time, Mexico had some gang violence going on, had some things that were kind of scary going on in there. And this van is following these two guys riding their bicycle. And the van pulls up, and they're kind of puffing along in the heat of the Mexican desert, and the window rolls down, and the man looks out and goes, "You look hungry. Do you want some pizza?" And he had purchased a pizza for them. Well, you know what? To be human is to be hungry. And every day of our lives, we get hungry. And just about every day, we eat something. When somebody's sick, we bring them some food. When we're celebrating something, we take them some food. We show up at people's doorsteps with a casserole or cinnamon rolls or whatever as a way to be with them. Because to be human is not just to be hungry, but also to eat and have those hungers satisfied. And here's Jesus. Right, in the Gospel of John, chapter 21, here's Jesus showing up when his disciples least expect him. He's standing on that seashore and inviting them to come and share some bread and fish. And the disciples, they fished all night with no luck, but Jesus has something to give them, plenty of food to share. Jesus invites them to come and break bread with him in a way that reminds us of the bread at the Lord's table, the way he blessed and gave thanks for those loaves in the upper room. Jesus says, "Come." And we're going to be calling 2019, every year we pick a theme, we're calling 2019 the year outside the walls. And we're thinking about the walls of the church. How do we get outside the walls of the church? And as a congregation, this body of Christ in this place, how do we really love on our community? How do we, think about becoming the best friend of the school, becoming the best friend of first responders, right? How do we think of being the church, not just here on Sunday morning within the walls of the church, but being the church that's out in the community, loving kids, loving the elderly, and loving everybody in between? Because, I'm convinced that we don't just happen to be here in Mound Ridge. We don't just happen to live in whatever community we happen to live. I think that we are in those places intentionally. And I think that God is calling us to intentionally live our faith in our cities and towns and countrysides. I think that we are called to be present, to love the places that we find ourselves in. How can we be the church outside the walls of the church building? Now, some of you maybe have taken a mission trip in your life, right? Gone on a mission trip where you go to another country or you travel somewhere, do some relief work or disaster cleanup or whatever. And those are really good trips to make, these mission trips. I mean, I've done them too. But think about this. What would we do if we were to think about our community as a place of mission? If we were to think like this year in 2019, I kind of want to do a mission trip into the community where I live. I want to do a mission trip into Mound Ridge, into Gossel or North Newton or wherever that is, right? Into Newton, to wherever you live. What would it be if you did a mission trip into your community, into Heston, into all these varied communities we live? I remember once when we lived in Washington, and we were on the eastern side of Washington, and we gathered up some of our youth from a couple of the churches on the east side, and we went across the mountains down to Seattle and did a mission trip of several days with the youth. And we were hooking up with the Seattle Mennonite Church. They had this homeless ministry and this kind of It's not really a shelter, but a little building where they serve food. People can come and get some services. They can get a shower. They can store some stuff in lockers. And so there we were really cleaning this place up, right, and interacting with the homeless folks. And I'm there with the youth, and I'm like washing windows on this homeless ministry. And as I'm doing this, and I was happy to do it, but as I was doing it, I'm thinking to myself, man, the windows back at our house are pretty filthy, and Lisi would probably appreciate me washing the windows back home. So I went home, and after had this mission trip experience, and I cleaned our windows too, right? Sometimes I think we get the idea that mission is just like out there. But maybe sometimes we also need to look closer to home and say, hey, where are the windows like here that we need to clean? Where are it's not just other places, other countries, other communities, other people. Where are the things that we need to do right here in our own communities, right? How can we be missionaries to our blocks and neighborhoods and to our communities? Because we are called to be the church right where we are. We're called to be the church outside the walls. And here's the thing. We are the church outside the walls because Jesus goes outside the walls. And just as Jesus fed those disciples by the sea, he feeds us. And just as he sent those disciples out to feed and tend the sheep, so he sends us out too. And this week we are seeing how in the Gospels, Jesus feeds his people. This is a 2-part series on John 21. And this week we look at how Jesus feeds his disciples. Next week we'll focus on how he sends us out. And I think this is a really powerful scene. I love this passage in the Gospel of John. We're going to look at the second part of it next week. And remember that the disciples have experienced Jesus raised from the dead twice. There's those 2 times in the upper room when Jesus shows up. There was also that time when Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene. But in verse 14, John tells us that this is the 3rd time that Jesus has appeared to the disciples. So I think what he's doing is just counting the times when Jesus appeared to the gathered disciples. And Jesus, there's 2 times already. Here's the 3rd one. And what's interesting to me about this time when he appears to disciples on the seashore, what's interesting to me, and it's always even almost a little scary, is how people don't recognize Jesus right away. And in fact, that seems to be one of the main characteristics of these resurrection episodes. They don't recognize Jesus at first. Or at least, it takes them a little while. And I've heard it described as how when someone that we know and love maybe goes on a very long journey, and how they maybe have had experiences that have impacted them in profound ways, and they come back, maybe a year later or something, and we don't recognize them right away. It takes us a moment to realize that's them. They've been changed by their experiences. That's them, but it takes us a moment to recognize them. Their face is different. Their time has made its mark on their soul, and we see it in their eyes that something about them is different. And I think it was a little bit like that for Jesus. He has died and returned from the grave. He has journeyed to eternity and back, from death to life. And there is something about him that is different. And disciples aren't immediately sure that it's him. This scene in John 21 is something like Luke 5 when Jesus teaches from that boat. And Peter and James and John, they're there with him. And they haven't caught anything. So he tells them to throw their nets out into the deep water. Back in Luke 5 here, he says, throw your nets in on the other side. And when they do, they have so many fish that their nets begin to break. Now here Jesus calls out. And so verse 5, if you're looking at this, here he calls out. And it says in the NIV, friends, haven't you any fish? The word is actually children. I'm not sure why the NIV translates it friends. But children, haven't you any fish? No, they answer. And then verse 6, he says, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large fish. Now, just like when Mary, the mother of Jesus, told the servants at the wedding in Cana to do whatever Jesus said, and then Jesus turns the water into wine, and there is this super abundance of wine. So too on that boat, when Jesus told the disciples to cast their net in on the right side, there was this super abundance of fish. When we're willing to do what Jesus says, we experience that abundance. And then perhaps Remember also that miracle that they had experienced at the beginning when they encountered Jesus, and they think of that. And that miracle that they left their nets and their boats and their families and they followed him. And young John, who was there, young John, the one who is called the disciple whom Jesus loved in the Gospel of John, he recognizes Jesus. And he tells Peter, he maybe remembers all the way back how it was before. And Peter, in his great enthusiasm for the Lord, look at what Peter does. It says that he puts on his outer garment, right? He's kind of thinking about it all backwards, but he's so excited. It's Jesus. He puts on his coat and jumps into the water and swims to shore. I mean, most people don't put on their coats to swim, but he wants to get to Jesus, right? So he does something a little strange. And then the rest, they come in the boat, and they find that Jesus has a fire going and fish cooking and bread there heating up on the fire. And Jesus tells them to bring some of the fish that they had caught to him. And look at this, verse 11. Simon Peter climbed aboard and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153, but even with so many, the net was not torn. Now, I don't know if you noticed that just a moment earlier, it says he brings the net ashore, but if you notice just a moment earlier, verse 6, when they throw their nets overboard, they did it, that's all of these disciples who go fishing. They're named up in verse 2, right? It's Peter and Thomas and Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples. They're there, and verse 6, it says they cannot haul in the nets because of the large fish. It's too heavy for them. But suddenly, here's Peter on the shore with Jesus, and what's he do? Well, he just pulls that net in, right? Peter just does it, right? Then single-handedly, what the other disciples couldn't do together a moment earlier. Now, it could be that the Gospels are telling us something about Peter's great strength, this adrenaline rush of seeing Jesus. I think that's probably what's going on, but I think there's also some symbolism here. The net represents the church's outreach, and Jesus he said earlier, Jesus said, you're going to be fishers of men. He said that to Peter back at the beginning of the gospel, and Peter is the chief among the apostles. And without him, the church would not be able to successfully carry out its mission to reach all the nations. So Peter does what they couldn't do together. They need Peter. And the gospel tells us that there are 158 fish. And look, no one is totally sure what this 158 fish is about. It's probably a symbolic number that represents all the people of the world, that the good news of Jesus is for everyone, that everyone has a place in the church. Just pull them all in, bring them all in, fishers of men. But I think also verse 13, we got to look at that because this is the key for today. Jesus came, took the bread, gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. Now, this might not seem like much, this action that Jesus takes, right? They've been fishing, they come ashore, they pull in that net, they meet Jesus. This might not seem like much, but remember in that upper room when Jesus gave the church the gift of the communion meal. He takes a loaf of bread and he blesses or gives thanks, and then he breaks it and he gives it to his disciples. And so 2 of those same words are here, right? He takes that bread and then he gives it to them. And I think what the gospel is doing is helping us to hear an echo of the communion meal there by the sea. Jesus is feeding his disciples. And yes, it's a meal of fish and bread. It's nourishment for hungry stomachs. But I think there's also something deeper, this meal that bears the stamp of Jesus' own life, a mystical meal fit for hungry hearts. Now, next week, we're going to look at this next part of the passage where Jesus says to Peter, feed my sheep, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. But Jesus commissions Peter in that passage and the other disciples to feed his flock, to feed his people. But before Jesus gives them the command to feed others, Jesus feeds them. And that strikes me as important. Because, we set goals in our church. We set goals in our leadership teams every year. And we look for people to fill different roles within the church. If you haven't got your call, you'll probably get one soon, right? But, it takes all of us, right, to do the work of the church. And it ends up being a whole lot of work. And I find myself doing this, right, where I start to think about following Jesus as work. And I realized this the other day. We pray together over our meals as a family, pray over our evening meal, and I found myself saying, Lord, give us strength for your work. And, I do want strength for the work that God has given us, but what kind of a message does that send, right? It's as if the point of giving thanks, the point of following Jesus, is so that we could do work. I mean, yes, his work, but work nonetheless. And Jesus did say back in John 15:5, apart from me, you can do nothing, which means that we will not be able to do his work apart from him. But apart from me, you can do nothing means that first and foremost, we will not be able to experience true and grateful life without Jesus. And I think the risk is that we always move so quickly to doing, when Jesus is calling us first off just to be with him. Just come to the fire. Just share the meal that he offers. Just receive his bread. Jesus feeds us. And I think that we've got to keep that in mind. I think we have to take that to heart. What God desires above all is not that we do work for him, that we do great things for him, but that we simply are with him. God desires intimate communion with us, his creations. And even though God gives us amazing gifts and strength and creativity to do the work of the kingdom, to pull in those nets like Peter with that strength of 10 men, God feeds us first and foremost because he loves us and wants to be with us. That's it. One time we opened our front door, and there on the porch there was this big old cardboard box, and had no note, had no address, had nothing. But when we opened that box, we found all kinds of goodies. We found cookies and banana breads and chocolates. And we said, well, who gave us this, right? And we kind of suspected, because a neighbor of ours had discreetly sent a text a couple of weeks earlier and said, do you have any dietary restrictions? And so we kind of sent a text and said, did you leave that box for us? And she just responded, Merry Christmas. But there it was. She didn't want anything. It wasn't, any kind of a trade. It was just enjoy. Here's a box. My name's not even on it. Just have this and have a Merry Christmas. So imagine this. Jesus did not have to be there on that beach. He didn't have to cook those fish and bake that bread. He could have just showed up again in the upper room and gave the disciples more instruction about the work that he has for them, but he didn't. Jesus chose to be on that beach at that time because he wanted to feed his disciples. And here's the thing. Jesus shows up on the seashores of our lives with bread in hand. He knows we're hungry. He knows when we've been working with very little to show for it. He knows when we have been up all night and we are exhausted. And Jesus says, come here. Come and have something to eat. He wants to feed us. He wants to share life with us. Jesus feeds us. And I think when we really start to wrap our heads around this fact, maybe not understanding the whole mystery of what happens in communion, as if that were possible, but when we really start to wrap our minds around this fact that Jesus is drawing us to him, that he wants to break bread with us, when we understand that Jesus feeds us, I think there's something in our souls that begins to long for that. I think we begin to hunger and thirst for him. I know I do. And just in a little bit, we're going to be coming to the table. We're going to be sharing Jesus' bread and Jesus' cup. And we're going to have the opportunity to be fed by Jesus, just like those disciples long ago. So I want to encourage you in a little bit as we do that, to enter into this story, to imagine yourself coming to Jesus on the seashore, to see Jesus giving you that bread. Lay down your expectations or lack of expectations, your hurry and your thinking about what comes next, and just let Jesus feed you. Let Jesus nourish you with his living bread. Because we need him. Because apart from him, we can do nothing. It's the constant prayer of the church down through the ages. Jesus, feed us.